Charlotte Ellis was 40 years old on the day she decided to die at home. Not in the sterile hush of a hospital ward with its beeping monitors and plastic tubes, but in the small red-brick terraced house on Anderton Road in Sparkbrook, Birmingham, where the bedroom window overlooked the same sycamore tree she had watched turn gold every autumn since she was 17. The cancer had already eaten most of her left lung, half her liver, and was now gnawing at the bones of her spine, yet she still looked beautiful in the way only the very ill can: skin almost translucent, cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper, eyes the color of wet slate that seemed to hold twice as much light as everyone else's. Hey friends, welcome back to GraceTime with Auntie. I'm so happy to see you here. Tell me, which country are you watching from today? Grab your coffee, sit back, and let's dive into today's amazing story together. Mason watched her from the doorway every morning, terrified that if he blinked, she would simply fade into the wallpaper. They had been married 12 years, together since the sixth form common room at Lordswood Girls' School, when he was the quiet boy from the boys' school across the road who lent her his headphones so she could listen to Dylan Reed's first demo tape. That tape had been the beginning of everything. The late-night drives to unsigned gigs in Digbeth. The promise they made at 19 that whoever died first would haunt the other until they were sick of ghosts. The wedding in the registry office on Broad Street with 23 guests, and a playlist that started and ended with Dylan Reed. Now the same singer was coming to their living room to sing the last song she would ever hear live. And Mason had spent the last 3 months arranging it in absolute secrecy, because Charlotte had once said, half joking, that the only thing that could make dying bearable would be hearing Dylan Reed play Paper Houses Unplugged before she lost the strength to clap. Mason had sold his motorbike, cashed in the last of his pension, called in every favor from the days when he used to book bands at the Rainbow, and somehow persuaded Dylan's management that this was not a prank call from a desperate husband, but a genuine once-in-a-lifetime request. They had agreed on one condition: total silence until the day itself. No leaks, no social media, no excited whispers. Charlotte must believe it was an ordinary birthday until the moment the doorbell rang. So Mason lied. He told her they were having a quiet night in, just the two of them, fairy lights, her favorite lemon drizzle cake from the Polish bakery on Ladypool Road, and the new series of that Scandi Noir she liked. He watched her face fall for a fraction of a second before she covered it with the brave smile she had perfected over 4 years of scans and chemo and false dawns, and he hated himself for the lie, even though it was the kindest lie he had ever told. The morning of her birthday dawned cold and bright, the kind of March day that tricks you into thinking winter is finally over. Charlotte woke early, pain rippling through her ribs like hot wire, but she refused the morphine because she wanted to be awake, truly awake, for whatever hours remained. Mason brought her tea in the chipped Dylan Reed tour mug they had bought in 2009 at the O2 Academy and sat on the edge of the bed while she sipped it slowly, both of them pretending this was normal. Just another Saturday. He had spent the night blowing up silver and rose gold balloons until his lungs ached. They now bobbed against the ceiling like jellyfish, catching the weak sunlight. Downstairs, the living room had been transformed. He had moved the sofa against the wall, cleared the rug, set up 40 tea lights in glass jars because 40 was how old she was today, and hidden Dylan's guitar case behind the curtains. Friends had been instructed to park 2 streets away and arrive only after the signal, 3 flashes of the front porch light. Charlotte's mother, Patricia, who had flown in from Spain the week before and was staying in the spare room pretending she wasn't crying every night, kept wandering into the kitchen asking if she could help with the cake, and Mason kept inventing tasks to keep her busy because the cake was already hidden in the shed. By midday, Charlotte was tired, the pain a constant drumbeat behind her eyes, but she insisted on getting dressed. She chose the emerald green dress she had worn to marry him in, now hanging loose on her skeletal frame, and asked Mason to fasten the tiny buttons at the back because her fingers shook too much. When he knelt to do it, his hands trembled so violently he had to start again 3 times. She caught his reflection in the mirror and said softly, "You look more nervous than our wedding day." And he forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. At 3 o'clock, she fell asleep on the sofa under the crocheted blanket her grandmother had made, and Mason stood in the hallway, texting frantically. Everyone was in place. Dylan had landed at Birmingham Airport an hour ago. The car was 5 minutes away. Everything was going exactly to plan. And yet he felt sick with dread, because what if she was too weak? What if the shock was too much? What if this final gift killed her faster than the cancer? He need not have worried about the shock. When the doorbell rang at 4:30 exactly, Charlotte was awake again, sipping sparkling water because alcohol made her vomit now, and she frowned because they weren't expecting anyone. Mason's heart hammered so loudly he was sure she could hear it. He opened the door, and there stood Dylan Reed, older than the posters, silver threading his famous black curls, wearing a battered leather jacket and carrying an acoustic guitar case, looking suddenly shy on an ordinary Birmingham doorstep. Behind him stood his tour manager, holding a small amplifier and a single microphone stand. Mason could not speak. Dylan smiled the crooked smile that had made teenage Charlotte scream in 2006 and said quietly, "Happy birthday, Charlotte. Mason says you've got a decent living room for a gig." Charlotte appeared in the hallway behind Mason, leaning on her walking stick, eyes huge in her thin face, and for a moment nobody moved. Then she whispered, "You're not real." And Dylan laughed softly and answered, "I'm real enough to play you a song or 10 if you'll let me in." Mason stepped aside, and Dylan walked past him carrying the scent of cold air and airports and something indefinably famous. Charlotte's legs gave way, and Mason caught her just in time, half carrying her to the sofa while Dylan sat up in the corner by the fireplace with the calm efficiency of someone who had played arenas, yet understood this was the most important show of his life. The tea lights flickered. The balloons swayed gently. Patricia appeared in the doorway with tears already streaming, and Mason motioned her to stay quiet. When Dylan tuned the first string, Charlotte made a small sound like a sob and a laugh combined, and Mason sat beside her and took her hand and felt the bones beneath the papery skin and knew that whatever happened next, he had done the right thing. Dylan looked up, met Charlotte's eyes across the tiny room and said, "This first one's the song you requested when you were 16 and snuck backstage at the Irish Center with a Sharpie and too much hope. I never forgot you, Charlotte Ellis, as you were then. Happy birthday." And he began to play the opening chords of Paper Houses, the song that had soundtracked their entire love story. And Charlotte closed her eyes and let the music carry her back to a time when her body was strong and the future was endless, and Mason was just a boy with headphones, who looked at her like she was already a miracle. The suspense of the moment hung in the air like incense. She was here, she was alive, she was listening to the voice she had loved since puberty, singing only for her, and nobody knew how many minutes or hours she had left. But for now the pain was distant, and the room was full of light, and the man she loved was holding her hand so tightly it hurt, and everything, for one suspended heartbeat, was perfect. Dylan's voice filled the small living room the way sunlight fills a jar, slow, golden, impossible to contain. He sang Paper Houses exactly the way he had recorded it in 2005. No fancy arrangements, no backing track, just his battered Martin guitar and that husky Midlands meets Nashville timbre that had made Charlotte fall in love with music before she ever fell in love with Mason. Every lyric felt brand new and ancient at the same time. The line about building homes out of promises we can't keep, the bridge where the harmony cracks open like an egg and spills heartbreak everywhere. Charlotte's lips moved silently with every word. She had known this song longer than she had known her husband, longer than she had known her own diagnosis. Mason watched her face instead of the singer, because her face was the only thing in the world that mattered. Tears slid sideways into her hair. but she was smiling the real smile, the one that reached her eyes and made the pain retreat a few inches. When the final chord faded, the room stayed silent for so long that the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a jet engine. Dylan let the hush settle, then said softly, "That was for 16-year-old Charlie, who waited 3 hours in the rain for an autograph. This next one is for the woman who taught a whole generation how to be brave." He shifted into The Long Way Round, the slow waltz they had played at their wedding reception, while Mason spun her under fairy lights in the garden of the Old Crown in Digbeth. Halfway through the second verse, Charlotte's breathing changed. It grew shallow, quick, the way it did when the morphine was wearing off and the cancer reminded her who owned her body now. Mason felt panic rise like bile. He squeezed her hand twice, their old code for, "I'm here, I've got you," but her fingers barely responded. Patricia appeared with the emergency morphine vial and a spoon, but Charlotte shook her head almost imperceptibly. Not yet. She wanted to stay inside the music for as long as possible. Dylan saw the exchange, his eyes, flicked to Mason with a question, and Mason answered with the smallest nod, "Keep going." So Dylan kept going, song after song, each one a memory pulled out of the air and made flesh again. He played the B-side nobody remembered, the cover of Hallelujah he had done for Radio 1 Live Lounge, the unreleased track he had written after his own mother died. Between songs he talked, not the polished stage banter, but real quiet words about losing people, about how music sometimes fails and sometimes it is the only thing that doesn't. Charlotte listened with her eyes closed, head resting on Mason's shoulder, and every time she exhaled, Mason counted the seconds until she inhaled again, terrified the gap would stretch into forever. At one point, she opened her eyes and looked straight at Dylan and whispered, "Play the one you wrote when you were 19 and heartbroken in a bedsit in Handsworth." Dylan smiled like he had been waiting for the request his whole career and answered, "I only ever played that once, at an open mic night in the Jug of Ale 2003. You were there." She nodded, tears spilling faster now. "I was the only one who clapped." He laughed under his breath. "You always were my best audience." And he began the song nobody else in the world had asked for in 20 years, the one about a boy who thought love would fix him and learned too late that some things can only be carried, not cured. Mason felt the years collapse. Suddenly they were 20 again, drunk on cider in Mason's tiny flat above the chip shop on Soho Road, Charlotte singing harmony while Dylan recorded on a 4-track that smelled of vinegar and possibility. The memory hurt so perfectly that Mason had to bite the inside of his cheek to stay in the present. By the time the song ended, Charlotte was trembling, pain and joy fighting for dominance inside her fragile frame. Patricia knelt in front of her with the morphine, but Charlotte turned her face into Mason's neck and whispered, "One more. Please, just one more." Mason looked at Dylan, eyes pleading, and Dylan understood immediately. He set the guitar across his lap, leaned forward and said, "There's a song I never released. Wrote it last year after my manager told me about a woman in Birmingham who was dying and still sending me birthday messages on Instagram every year without fail. I thought, maybe tonight's the night it gets heard." Charlotte let out a sound that was half sob and laugh and wonder all at once. Dylan began to play, and the room shrank until it held only 4 people and 40, flickering flames and the certain knowledge that time was almost gone. The song was called 40 Wishes, and every verse was a year of Charlotte's life distilled into poetry. The year she broke her wrist falling off a bike at Cannon Hill Park, the year she got into university, the year she kissed Mason under the bull statue at New Street, the year the scans came back clear, the year they came back wrong. When he reached the final chorus, his voice cracked on the line. "I wish I could give you the sky back to you piece by piece," and Charlotte's grip on Mason's hand tightened so hard he felt bones grind together. She was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it, and Mason was crying too, silent tears that soaked the collar of her green dress. Patricia stood in the doorway with her face in her hands, and then, without warning, Charlotte tried to stand. Mason caught her before she fell, panic flaring hot in his chest, but she pushed at him weakly and rasped, "Want to be closer." Dylan stopped mid-chord, but she shook her head. "No, keep playing, please." So Mason half-carried her across the rug until she was sitting on the floor directly in front of the singer, her back against Mason's folded legs, his arms around her waist like they were teenagers again at a gig. Dylan started the chorus again from the beginning, softer this time, almost a lullaby, and Charlotte lifted one shaking hand as if she could touch the notes hanging in the air. Her lips moved. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The song ended on a single unresolved chord that seemed to float forever. In the silence that followed, Charlotte turned her head with obvious effort and looked up at Mason. Her eyes were glassy but fierce. She whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "Best birthday present in the whole world, but I'm scared." Mason pressed his forehead to hers and answered, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes, took one deliberate breath, then another, and Mason felt the shift inside her body, the moment the pain finally won the long war. Her hand went slack in his. Dylan's guitar string twanged softly as he set the instrument aside, understanding before anyone else. Patricia made a sound like an animal in pain. Mason didn't move, couldn't move, just held his wife while her breathing slowed to the rhythm of a distant tide going out. Charlotte opened her eyes one last time, looked straight at Dylan, and smiled the smallest, most perfect smile, and said in a voice as clear as a bell, "Thank you for the best birthday. Now let me go." And with those words still hanging in the candlelight, she slipped away, quietly, gracefully, as if she had simply decided the concert was over and it was time to go home. The room held its breath with her. Dylan sat frozen, tears sliding down his famous face. Patricia sank to her knees. Mason kept rocking Charlotte gently, humming the last chorus under his breath because it was the only thing left to do, the only way to keep her here for 3 more seconds. 2, 1, and then even the humming stopped because there was nothing left to hold on to except the echo of the final note and the certain knowledge that the song, and Charlotte's song, had ended exactly where it was always meant to. The silence that followed Charlotte's last breath was not peaceful. It was a violent, roaring vacuum that sucked every scrap of oxygen from the room and left only the smell of melted wax and the faint metallic trace of death settling in. Mason did not scream, did not cry out, did not even breathe for the first 10 seconds. He simply stared at her face as though waiting for the punchline of a joke only the two of them had ever understood. Her lips were still curved in that small, satisfied smile, the one that said she had heard every note she needed to hear and was now free to leave the concert early. Dylan Reed, a man who had played to 60,000 people without flinching, looked suddenly very small on the rug, hands still hovering over guitar strings that would never be played for her again. Patricia let out a single, broken animal noise and crawled across the floor to her daughter, pressing trembling fingers to Charlotte's neck as if the cancer might have made a mistake this time. Mason finally inhaled, a sharp tearing sound, and the spell cracked. He bent over Charlotte's body and pressed his mouth to her ear and whispered the same 3 words he had whispered every single night for 12 years. "See you soon." Then he began to shake, great convulsive shudders that had nothing to do with the cold March evening pressing against the windows. Dylan stood up slowly, guitar forgotten, and took one step back as though afraid of intruding on a moment too private, even for the man who had just sung her across the threshold. Patricia was sobbing now, raw, ugly sobs that scraped the walls, but Mason heard none of it. He was listening for the next breath that would never come, counting heartbeats that belonged only to him now. The tea lights were burning low, some already drowning in their own wax, and the balloons overhead had begun to sag as the helium surrendered to gravity, turning the room into a slow-motion underwater scene. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed toward the Heartlands Hospital, and Mason thought absurdly that it was too late. The ambulance should have come years ago, before the first lump, before the first clear scan turned into the second that wasn't. He rocked Charlotte gently, the way he had rocked her through every round of chemo, when the sickness was so bad she begged him to let her die then and there, and he had refused because love had felt stronger than biology. Now biology had won, and love was left holding a body that was cooling degree by degree, minute by minute, and he hated himself for every single time he had promised her tomorrow. Dylan cleared his throat, a rough, painful sound, and said, I'll call someone. But Mason shook his head without looking up. Not yet. 5 more minutes, please. His voice cracked on the last word like a teenager's. Dylan nodded, wiped his face with the sleeve of his leather jacket, and retreated to the hallway where he stood guard over the wreckage of the happiest and worst evening of Mason's life. Patricia crawled closer and laid her head on Charlotte's knees, stroking the green dress that now looked like a costume on a doll. The three of them formed a strange, broken tableau. The mother, the husband, the stranger who had sung the dying into death, all orbiting the still center that had been Charlotte Ellis only moments before. Time did something cruel then. It slowed to the consistency of treacle and stretched those 5 minutes into an eternity in which Mason catalogued every detail so he would never forget. The faint freckles across her nose that the illness had not managed to erase, the tiny scar on her lower lip from when she bit it during their first kiss, the way her wedding ring had become loose enough to spin with the slightest movement. He slipped the ring off her finger, kissed the pale circle of skin it left behind, and slid it onto his own little finger where it fit perfectly, a promise reversed. Only when the first candle sputtered out entirely did he loosen his grip. He laid Charlotte gently back against the sofa cushions, arranged her hands across her stomach the way she used to sleep, and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Okay," he said to no one and everyone. "You can call now." Dylan pulled out his phone with shaking hands and stepped into the kitchen. Mason heard fragments of the conversation. Female, 40 years old, at home, expected, peaceful. "Thank you for being quick." Patricia was humming under her breath, an old nursery rhyme Charlotte had loved as a child, and the sound was so heartbreaking that Mason had to stand up or risk shattering completely. He walked to the window and stared out at Anderton Road, where neighbors' curtains were already twitching. Someone must have recognized the famous car parked 2 streets away. The sky had turned the color of bruised plums, streetlights flickering on one by one like reluctant stars. He thought about the years they would never have, the children they never managed to make, the retirement in Whitby they used to joke about, the songs Dylan would write now that would carry Charlotte's ghost in every chorus. Behind him, the front door opened and closed softly as the undertakers arrived far too soon and not soon enough. They were kind, professional, spoke in the low, respectful voices reserved for fresh grief. Mason signed something, answered questions he didn't hear, watched them wrap Charlotte in a soft burgundy blanket because white felt too cruel. When they lifted her onto the stretcher, she looked impossibly small, a child playing at being grown up. Patricia tried to follow them out, but her legs gave way, and Dylan caught her, strong arms around the mother who had just lost her only daughter on her 40th birthday. Mason walked behind the stretcher to the gate, barefoot on the cold path, and stood there long after the private ambulance disappeared around the corner toward the mortuary on Yardley Road. The night air smelled of chips from the Balti house and impending rain. Somewhere a dog barked once and stopped, as if embarrassed by its own noise. Dylan appeared beside him, hands in pockets, looking suddenly like any other 40-something brummie who had seen too much. "I'm so sorry, mate," he said, the celebrity veneer completely gone. Mason nodded, throat too tight for words. They stood in silence until the first fat drops began to fall. Warm spring rain that felt like tears from a sky that had waited politely until Charlotte was gone before crying. Dylan offered to stay, to help with arrangements, to do anything, but Mason shook his head. "You gave her the perfect ending," he said, voice raw. "That's more than most people get. Go home to your family." "Dylan, thank you." Dylan hugged him then, a fierce, quick embrace between two men who had loved the same woman in entirely different ways, and walked away into the rain without looking back. Mason went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in 24 years, the house was completely quiet. The balloons had deflated further, brushing the floor like tired ghosts. The tea lights had all drowned. He sat on the sofa where she had died and stared at the place on the rug where Dylan's guitar had rested, trying to summon the echo of the last chord, but the room had already begun to forget the sound. Upstairs he could hear Patricia moving around, opening and closing drawers, the ordinary sounds of grief beginning its slow bureaucracy. He thought about sleeping, about eating, about breathing, and none of it seemed possible. Instead, he took Charlotte's phone from the coffee table, entered the passcode, their wedding date, and opened the voice memos. There, recorded at 3:17 a.m., 2 nights ago, when he had been downstairs pretending to wrap presents, was a new file titled, "For Mason, When I'm Gone." His heart stopped all over again. He pressed play, and her voice, weaker than he remembered but unmistakably hers, filled the room, telling him she loved him, that the concert had been the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done, that she wasn't scared anymore because she had heard the song that would carry her the rest of the way. She ended with, "Don't stay stuck in this house, darling. Live the years I couldn't. I'll be the breeze that moves the curtains and the song you hear on the radio when you least expect it. Happy birthday to us both." The recording clicked off. Mason played it again, and again, and again, until the rain stopped and the sky began to pale with a new day that Charlotte would never see, and somewhere inside the ache, a tiny seed of something that might one day become peace began, impossibly, to take root. The days after Charlotte left blurred into a gray, underwater existence where sound arrived late and every color had been leached out of the world. Mason moved through the house like a man learning to walk again after an amputation, touching the edges of furniture as though expecting them to bite. The living room remained exactly as it had been the night she died. 40 drowned tea lights still in their jars. Silver balloons now completely collapsed and wrinkled like the skins of strange fruit, the faint outline on the rug where Dylan's guitar case had rested. He could not bring himself to open the windows. The air still carried the ghost of her perfume, Jo Malone peony and blush suede, mixed with candle smoke and something indefinably medical, and he was terrified that fresh air would blow her away for good. Patricia stayed for the first week, cooking meals he didn't eat, answering the door to neighbors bearing lasagna and sympathy cards, sleeping in the spare room with the door open so she could hear him if he called out in his sleep, which he did every night, saying Charlotte's name like a question that would never be answered. The funeral was arranged for the following Friday at Lodge Hill Crematorium because Charlotte had once said she didn't want to be buried. Too final, too damp, let me be smoke and go find the sky. Mason chose the wicker coffin lined with emerald silk to match the dress she had worn on her last night, and when the funeral director asked if he wanted to see her one final time, he almost laughed because he had not stopped seeing her since the moment she closed her eyes. He spent hours sitting on the living room floor, listening to the voice memo on repeat until the battery died, and he had to crawl to find the charger without standing up, afraid his legs would no longer remember how. Friends came and went, speaking in the hushed tones people reserve for libraries and crime scenes. Someone left a shepherd's pie, someone else a bottle of Jameson. Someone brought a playlist of Dylan Reed's saddest songs, which Mason deleted immediately because he could not bear to hear that voice anywhere except inside his own skull, where it still sang 40 wishes on an endless loop. The inquest was straightforward. Death by metastatic breast cancer. Expected, no suspicious circumstances. Certificate signed. Within 48 hours. The bureaucracy of dying was mercilessly efficient. On the 8th night, Patricia packed her suitcase and stood in the doorway of the living room with tears sliding silently down her powdered cheeks. "I can stay longer," she said, but they both knew she couldn't. Her husband was alone in Spain, her own heart cracking under the weight. Mason hugged her so tightly he felt her ribs, and when she whispered, "She was so proud of you," he had to turn away because pride felt like a foreign concept now, something from another lifetime. After she left the house, achieved a new level of silence, the kind of silence that has texture, thick and velvety, and impossible to break. He slept on the sofa because the bed smelled too much like her and not enough. He showered only when the stench of himself became unbearable. He lost weight so quickly, his wedding ring spun on his finger, and he had to move Charlotte's ring from his little finger to his ring finger, where it fit perfectly, a silver band holding the place her warmth had vacated. The post brought sympathy cards by the dozen, some addressed in handwriting he recognized from primary school, others from strangers who had read about the concert on social media because of course someone had leaked it, grainy photographs of Dylan Reed leaving a Sparkbrook terrace in the rain, captions like "Singer Grant's dying fan final wish," and Mason hated them all because they turned the most sacred night of his life into clickbait. He stopped answering the landline. He muted every group chat. He existed in a narrow corridor between the sofa and the kitchen, sustained by cold tea and the certainty that if he stayed very still, time might forget to keep moving forward. Then, on the 11th morning, the doorbell rang and refused to stop. Mason ignored it until the letterbox flapped and a voice he had never expected to hear again called through. "Mason, mate, I know you're in there. I can see your shadow under the door." Dylan Reed was standing on the step holding 2 takeaway coffees and a paper bag that smelled of bacon. He looked exhausted, eyes bloodshot, the famous curls flattened by days of sleeplessness. Mason opened the door on the chain and stared. Dylan lifted the coffees in a small salute. "I'm not here as the singer," he said quietly. "I'm here as the bloke who watched your wife die in front of me and hasn't slept since. Let me in, yeah?" Mason unchained the door. They sat in the kitchen because Mason could not bear the living room yet, and Dylan placed a coffee in front of him like a peace offering. They drank in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock Charlotte had bought in Camden Market the year they turned 30. Finally, Dylan spoke. "I've canceled the European tour, told management I had a death in the family. They think I'm joking, but I'm not." Mason looked at him then, really looked, and saw the grief etched deep around the other man's eyes, grief that had no right to be there and yet was. "She asked me to record something for you," Dylan continued, pulling a small USB stick from his pocket and laying it on the table between them like a loaded weapon. "The night before the concert, she messaged me on Instagram, said if anything happened, she wanted you to have this. I recorded it in the hotel at 3 a.m. after. Mason stared at the tiny piece of plastic as though it might explode. His hand shook when he picked it up. Dylan stood. "I'll wait in the car. Take as long as you need." He left as quietly as he had come. Mason sat frozen for a long time, then crawled back to the sofa, plugged the USB into Charlotte's old laptop that still had a sticker of a unicorn on the lid, and pressed play. Charlotte's face filled the screen, filmed selfie style in their bedroom, the fairy lights from her birthday still tangled in the background. She looked worse than he remembered, cheekbones like blades, eyes enormous, but her voice was steady. "Hello, my love," she began, and Mason's legs gave way, so he sank to the floor in front of the screen. She talked for 23 minutes straight. She told him where she had hidden the birthday cards she never got to give him, the ones for the next 10 years already written and sealed. She told him the combination to the safe where their passports were because you're going to need adventures again one day. She told him which songs to play at the funeral. No hymns, only the ones we danced to when we were broke and stupid and happy. She told him she had left instructions with the solicitor that he was to scatter her ashes from the top of Clent Hills at sunrise, on the first day the heather was in bloom, because that was where he had proposed, and she wanted to come full circle. She told him, fiercely, that loneliness was not betrayal, that if he met someone who made him laugh, he was to marry her barefoot on a beach somewhere ridiculous and not feel guilty for a single second. She told him she had loved him perfectly and been loved perfectly in return, and that was rarer than diamonds. And at the very end, when her voice was only a thread, she leaned closer to the camera and said, "I'm going to ask Dylan for one last favor. When you're ready, when the pain is manageable instead of monstrous, he's going to play a gig and dedicate the last song to me. You have to be there, Mason. Promise me you'll stand in the crowd and let the music remind you that I'm still singing along, just from better seats." The video ended on her smile, the one from the birthday night, and Mason played it again immediately, then again, until the laptop battery died and the screen went black and reflected only his own ruined face back at him. That afternoon, he opened the curtains for the first time. Sunlight poured in like an accusation and a benediction at once. He gathered the dead balloons, blew out the hardened wax, folded the emerald dress, and placed it in tissue paper. He texted Dylan a single word. "When?" The reply came within seconds. 3 weeks. Robin 2 in Wolverhampton. Intimate gig, 200 tickets. I saved you one at the barrier. Mason stared at the message for a long time, then walked upstairs, opened the wardrobe, and took out the shirt he had worn the night Charlotte died. He held it to his face and inhaled what little of her remained, then hung it back up carefully because some ghosts are worth keeping close. Outside, spring was fighting its way through the cracked pavements of Sparkbrook, defiant green shoots pushing between bricks, and for the first time since her last breath, Mason felt something shift inside his chest, not healing exactly, but the tiniest loosening of the knot that had threatened to strangle him. He whispered to the empty house, 3 weeks, love, I'll be there. And somewhere in the breeze that moved the curtains for no reason at all, he swore he heard her answer, front row, center, I've got the best seat in the house. 3 weeks later, on a warm Friday evening in early April, Mason Ellis stood outside the Robin 2 in Wolverhampton, clutching a single ticket that had no seat number, because Dylan had written across the front in black marker, "Barrier. She saved this for you." The queue snaked around the red brick building, kids in vintage tour shirts mixed with older fans who remembered when Dylan was still playing the jug of ale for pints and exposure, and every single red roses were being sold by a girl with purple hair for £1 each because word had spread that tonight was the Charlotte gig. Mason had showered, shaved, and put on the same black shirt he had worn the night she died, the one that still carried the faintest trace of her perfume if he pressed the sleeve to his face and believed hard enough. He had not slept properly in 21 days, but grief had carved him into something sharper, cleaner, almost weightless, and when the doors opened, the bouncer took one look at the handwritten ticket, then at Mason's face, and simply lifted the velvet rope without a word. Inside, the venue smelled of beer and old wood and anticipation thick enough to chew. The stage was bare except for a single microphone stand, one stool, and a Martin guitar that looked exactly like the one that had rested on their living room rug the night Charlotte left. Mason walked straight to the front center, placed both palms on the cold metal barrier, and waited. People filled in around him, chatting, laughing, taking selfies, but a small circle of silence seemed to travel with him. Strangers glanced at his eyes and instinctively gave him space, as if they could smell death still clinging to his skin. The lights dimmed to a deep indigo, the low hum of conversation dropped to nothing, and Dylan Reed walked on stage alone. No band, no introduction, no smile for the crowd. He wore black jeans and the same battered leather jacket from Anderton Road, curls longer now, face gaunt with his own grief. He sat on the stool, adjusted the microphone to mouth height, and spoke without preamble. "Tonight is for a woman who taught me what music is actually for. Her name was Charlotte Ellis. She was 40 years old for exactly 6 hours and 23 minutes. And in those hours, she heard every song she ever wanted to hear. This gig is the encore she never got to applaud. Every penny from the door, every penny from the bar, every penny from merch goes to the breast cancer unit at Queen Elizabeth Hospital that tried so hard to save her. If you're here, you already know the rules. No phones, no filming, no shouting requests. Just listen the way she did." A ripple of understanding moved through the room like wind through wheat. Dylan picked up the guitar, closed his eyes for a long second, and began. He played for 2 solid hours without a break, every song Charlotte had ever loved. Some everyone knew, some only she had known, and between songs he told tiny stories. The night she heckled him at the Irish Centre for forgetting the bridge to his own song. The day she sent him a birthday message every single year without fail, even after he stopped answering fans. The way she looked when he sang 40 Wishes and knew it was goodbye. The crowd wept openly, mascara rivers, men with throats working soundlessly, roses lifted high like a red sea. Mason never moved, never blinked, just drank in the music the way a parched man drinks water, letting it flood every cracked place inside him. Near the end, Dylan set the guitar down, stood up, and said, "One more. This one was never released, never even demoed properly. Charlotte asked me to write it the week before she died. She gave me the title and 3 lines. I finished it on the train home the night she left us. I've only played it once, to an empty hotel room in Birmingham at 4 in the morning. Tonight is the second and last time it will ever be played." He sat again, took a breath that shook, and began the opening chords of a song called "See You Soon." The melody was simple, almost childlike, but the lyrics were a conversation across an unbridgeable distance. "I kept the ticket stub from the night we met. It's still in the wallet I'll carry till I forget how to walk. You took the long way round, but you got there first. Wait for me at the bar with the good whiskey and the terrible jokes." Mason felt his eyes, and suddenly he was back in the living room. Charlotte's head against his knee, her hand going slack, her last smile, and the music wrapped around the memory and held it gently instead of letting it cut. Dylan's voice cracked on the bridge, recovered, soared into the final chorus, where the lyric changed to present tense to future. "I'll see you soon. Not goodbye. Just a pause between songs. Keep the light on in the window, love. I'm only one more verse away." When the last note died, the venue stayed perfectly still for 10 full seconds, nobody daring to break whatever spell had been cast. And then the applause came, not the wild rock show roar, but a low, rolling wave of clapping and crying, and roses thrown softly onto the stage until the wood disappeared under red. Dylan stood, pressed both hands to his heart, bowed once to the spot where Mason stood, and walked off without another word. The house lights came up slowly, gently, and people began to leave in near silence, hugging each other, wiping faces, carrying the song with them like something fragile and precious. Mason stayed at the barrier until the very last person had gone, and the cleaners started stacking chairs. Only then did Dylan reappear, walk straight to him, and pulled him into a hug that felt like the closing of a circle. "She heard it," Dylan whispered against his shoulder. "I felt her in the room the whole time." Mason could only nod, throat sealed shut. They stood like that while the staff politely pretended not to watch, and when they finally let go, Dylan pressed something small and cold into Mason's hand. Charlotte's wedding ring, the one Mason had worn since the night she died, threaded now onto a thin silver chain. "She'd want you to wear it near your heart, not hiding on your finger," Dylan said. Mason fastened the chain around his neck, the ring settling against his skin exactly where her head had rested the night she left. And for the first time since that night, he cried. Not the silent leaking of the past weeks, but great, wrenching sobs that felt like they were turning him inside out and washing him clean. When there were no tears left, he looked up and realized the venue was empty, except for the two of them and the sea of red roses covering the stage. Dylan picked one up, stripped the thorns with his bare hands, and handed it to Mason. "For the hills," he said simply. Mason took it. They walked out together into the cool black country night, the sky above Wolverhampton clear and full of hard, bright stars that looked close enough to touch. Dylan's driver was waiting, but Mason shook his head. "I'm good," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "I've got somewhere to be." He caught the last train back to Birmingham, then a taxi to the edge of the city, and at 4:47 a.m. he began the long climb up Clent Hills with the single red rose in one hand and Charlotte's ashes in a small wooden box in the other. The heather was not yet in bloom, April was too early, but the grass was soft and the air tasted of dew and possibility. He reached the summit just as the horizon turned the color of pale peaches. There was no wind, only perfect stillness, the kind that makes you feel the planet breathing. Mason opened the box, let the ashes catch the first rays of sunrise, and scattered them in a wide arc that glittered gold for one impossible second before becoming part of the sky. He laid the rose on the exact spot where he had knelt to propose 16 years earlier, pressed his palm to the warm earth, and whispered, "Happy birthday, love. Best seats in the house, right?" A breeze rose out of nowhere, sudden and warm, lifting his hair, fluttering the petals of the rose, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of peony and blush swayed across the hillside. Mason smiled through the last of his tears, slipped the ring necklace under his shirt so the metal rested against his heartbeat, and started the long walk down. Behind him, the sun climbed higher, gilding the scattered ashes until they looked like a constellation fallen to earth. And somewhere in the brightening air, a voice only he could hear began to sing the final line of the song that had followed them across every border between living and dying. "See you soon, my love. See you soon." And Mason Ellis, 41 years old, newly widowed, utterly broken and strangely whole, walked into the rest of his life, carrying her the way she had asked to be carried, not as a weight, but as a melody. He would never stop humming, a promise kept across the only distance that matters, the one between one heartbeat and the next. Wow, friends, that was quite a story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did sharing it with you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to GraceTime with Auntie for more amazing stories. I can't wait to see you all in the next one. Take care and stay happy.